team for selecting Motif Bio to come and present to you this evening. My understanding is since I'm last on the agenda, I can take as long as I like. So I'm going to go through quite a bit of information here. We've been moving very quickly since we came to AIM in April, but I want you to know that everyone is going to receive a PDF copy of these slides by email afterwards, so you don't have to scribble like mad to capture all the details. Usual disclaimer statement, I'll be making some forward-looking statements. They may or may not become true. And this is, if you like, what I call a nutshell slide, the story in a nutshell. So Motif Bio is all about antibiotics. And we think we're in the right place at the right time because you may be familiar with a book that was written by the chief medical officer in England, Dame Sally Davis. And there's been a lot of media attention around this subject. According to Sally Davis, we are potentially about 5 years away from a cut finger, again, becoming fatal. So we take for granted, way back since the 1940s, that antibiotics are there and available. So if you get a nasty infection in your finger or a grazed knee, it doesn't matter because there's antibiotics there. People who are unfortunate enough to require chemotherapy for cancer require antibiotic therapy as well. If you require a knee replacement or hip replacement, antibiotics are required in that setting as well. And the problem is that antibiotics have not been coming to market over the last 10 to 15 years as they previously were. But the bacteria are continuing to mutate and develop resistance to existing antibiotics. So there's a really important need for companies like Motif Bio to be able to bring novel antibiotics to market and quickly. And it's not one solution that's going to solve this. We need several different antibiotics, hopefully in the next several years. So our lead program is a novel antibiotic called Iclaprim, which is what most of my presentation will be about. It's a different, underutilized mechanism to all the other antibiotics in development. We're targeting, thoughtfully and purposely, the serious, life-threatening hospital infections. And I'll say a little bit more about that. You'll see what I mean by serious and life-threatening. We had an FDA meeting back in April where we sat face-to-face with the anti-infectives division, and they agreed with our proposals to take Iclaprim into phase 3 with 2 indications: acute bacterial skin and skin structure infections, so I don't have to keep saying that all the time, ABSSSI, and hospital-acquired bacterial pneumonia are the 2 lead indications that we're targeting for Iclaprim. Very importantly, over the summertime, we were able to announce that the FDA has granted us something called QIDP designation. That stands for Qualified Infectious Disease Product. And the reason that that's important is it grants Iclaprim 10 years of market exclusivity in the United States from the date of approval. And we're on track to complete our 2 pivotal phase 3 trials second half of 2017. And we would expect to get an approval from FDA middle of 2018. So from 2018, we have 10 years of market exclusivity in the US. Similar system in Europe. It works a little bit differently, 8+2. Our phase 3 data would be granted 8 years of data exclusivity, and then Europe grants a further 2 years of market exclusivity. So again, 10 years of market exclusivity. And then a key milestone that we were able to announce just last month, actually, was that we've moved to full contract with our CRO, or Clinical Research Organization. This is the company that actually conducts the phase 3 clinical trials for us. And we selected Covance, one of the top 3 CROs worldwide. And it so happens that Covance has conducted about 75% of all the antibiotic trials in the last 5 years. So we went through a competitive bid process. We thought Covance was head and shoulders above the others that we talked to, and they're clearly very, very experienced. And where we are with the phase 3 trials is as follows. We've identified, thanks to Covance, approximately 160 trial sites in the United States, Europe, and a couple of Latin America countries. We have investigators being signed up as we speak. We have protocols being shared with the investigators, and we're ready to get that first patient recruited very shortly. I'm also going to mention that we're building a pipeline following behind Iclaprim. We'll talk about where our share price is, what our cash position is, where we're going next, and we'll talk about the team which we think is the right team to execute on our plan. So as I mentioned on the first slide, Iclaprim on the left-hand side here, you can see happens to be called a dihydrofolate reductase inhibitor, if you really wanted to know. But the point is it's in a completely different column to all the other antibiotics that target these hospital serious, life-threatening, what's called gram-positive infections. So everything else that's either on the market or in development works a different way. So if the bacteria are resistant to these other mechanisms, Iclaprim works in a completely different way and can still be effective. So that's the first point of differentiation. Second point can be, I think, very, very important to us. This chart shows in green how fast Iclaprim works under laboratory conditions. So after about 4.5 hours, you have full efficacy at killing bacteria. The red line is another antibiotic called vancomycin, which is what we're comparing against in our phase 3 program. And as you can see from the chart, it takes closer to 9 hours for vancomycin to be bactericidal. And so at the top of the slide, the headline here, rapidly bactericidal. That's important for a couple of reasons. Fast acting, if you have a life-threatening infection, I suspect that you would like something to be really fast acting. And as you're going to see later, that also, we believe, can give us some really important advantages in terms of saving hospital costs, which is important around the world, but particularly the way the reimbursement formulary system works in the US. So that's the second point. Iclaprim is rapidly bactericidal. Just building from that, there are two ways that antibiotics can work. They can be either bactericidal, which means cidal means to kill, or bacteriostatic, which means they just stop bacteria multiplying. So the two columns at the far side, the so-called oxazolidinones and the tetracyclines, are bacteriostatic. That's less good clinically than bactericidal. It's also more likely to encourage rapid resistance development. So bactericidal is a really good place to be for Iclaprim. And then the next piece, I think, is another really important piece of differentiation for us with Iclaprim. Many, if not most, patients who end up in hospital with these serious life-threatening infections are from the baby boomer generation or perhaps older, and they tend to be what's called comorbid. That means they have something else wrong with them. Because usually it's people with immune systems that are not fully competent that succumb to these nasty, serious, life-threatening infections. So think about type 2 diabetes, think about obesity, and in this case, think about kidney disease. So somewhere between 25 and 30% of patients in hospital with serious infections also have kidney disease, or renal insufficiency as it's known here. And the problem with most of the other antibiotics, so the three columns on the right here, is if patients have kidney disease, they have to be monitored and they have to check blood levels of something called creatinine, which is a marker for kidney disease. And then the antibiotic dose has to be adjusted accordingly to avoid toxicity and to ensure that the antibiotic is working. Interestingly, Iclaprim does not require any dose adjustment in patients with renal insufficiency. So again, there's a saving in hospital costs. It also makes it much easier for the hospital physician to use Iclaprim in what's called empirically first-line therapy. So you can see there's a number of differentiators that we think are important for Iclaprim. The next piece is that Iclaprim was actually originally discovered by Hoffmann-La Roche in Switzerland, and they designed Iclaprim to overcome a mutation that causes resistance to another antibiotic called trimethoprim. And so what you see here on this chart is two other antibiotics. The blue line is something called rifampin, and the red line is trimethoprim. And under laboratory conditions, if you expose this particular bacterium, Staphylococcus aureus, this particular strain, to rifampin and to trimethoprim, you very quickly get resistance development. With Iclaprim, which is the green line along the bottom, even after 22, 23, what's called serial passages, little or no evidence of resistance. So Iclaprim has a very low propensity for resistance development, which again we believe is very, very important. So putting all of this together, in terms of treating these serious hospital infections, the cost of the antibiotic is usually only about 10% of the overall cost. The rest is the bed, the nurse, all the equipment, et cetera, et cetera. So a fast-acting antibiotic can have a huge cost-saving benefit to the hospital. And just keep that in mind, because I'm going to come back and tell you how we're going to try and unlock that potential with Iclaprim. Okay? So this really just puts together everything that I just said. Now, why do we have this crisis with antibiotics? Well, as I mentioned, or started to mention, many of the big pharma companies in the last 10 to 15 years have decided that antibiotics are not commercially attractive enough. So when they're putting together their $6–7 billion annual R&D budget, they've been deciding in the past, and by the way, I was at Merck & Co. Inc. 26 years, so I guess I can take some of the blame here. They decided to focus on chronic infections, so cancers, hypertension, high blood pressure, cholesterol, because patients who have to take those drugs take a pill every day for the rest of their life. Antibiotics are usually 10 to 14 days of therapy, and they're very low priced. So the current brand price point in the US for hospital antibiotics is about $350 a day. So let's make the math easy. 10 days of treatment, $3,500. Drug pricing's been in the news quite a bit in the US the last few weeks. Hillary's jumped on the bandwagon for political reasons. Oncology drugs which preserve life for perhaps 3 months, 6 months are also in the news for being priced at $200,000 and $300,000 and $400,000. So there's a disconnect between prolonging life for cancer patients for a few months and antibiotics, which save life, and yet they're only costing $3,500. So, two things. The market, I think, has to start correcting that. And I think it'll be both ways. There's a tremendous amount of pressure on these really, really high-priced oncology drugs. But also with antibiotic pricing, a company called Allergan, which used to be called Actavis, which used to be called Forest, and then Warner Lambert was involved as well. They've just launched an antibiotic called Avicaz, and they've priced it at $14,000. So still very reasonable, but a good increase from $3,500. There's only 2 quarters of sales so far, but it's been very well accepted by the hospitals. So my point is there's tremendous upside, I think, in the price potential before we come to market in 2018. And what we're seeing on this slide is that governments also are standing up and taking notice, and they're saying, what can we do as governments to incentivize companies like Motif to come to market with novel antibiotics? Because if we don't, we have a crisis on our hands. So you may have read about Cameron's initiative that he set up in 2012. Jim O'Neill, formerly Goldman Sachs, chairs the Antimicrobial Review Committee. They're talking about upfront payments to companies like Motif upon approval of a new antibiotic in the UK. They're talking about NHS contract pricing. I think the most tangible evidence of government support so far, though, has come from the so-called GAIN Act in the United States. GAIN stands for Generating Antibiotic Incentives Now. And it's under the GAIN Act, which became law in 2012, that Iclaprim has been granted QIDP, Qualified Infectious Disease Product Designation. And that is what gives us 10 years of market exclusivity, and it also gives an accelerated review period of 6 months. This one is an interesting one. It just became an act at the beginning of this year, so it's not yet law, but the Disarm Act is aimed at the government payment systems in the US, Medicare and Medicaid, who like to pay generic prices like most European governments. The Disarm Act is going to mandate that Medicare and Medicaid pay a brand price just for antibiotics if that's what the clinician determines is the right choice for the patient. So my point is, again, we think we're in the right place at the right time. Governments are stepping up, looking to develop incentives for companies like Motif, and the market is already, with Allergan's pricing of Avicaz, we're starting to see improvements in pricing for antibiotics. As a result of the two things that I just talked about, the forecast is for the antibiotic market globally to grow tremendously over the next 5 years. And at the top of the slide, there's two drivers. The good old baby boomer generation, so that unfortunately there's going to be more patients. But secondly, because we're starting to see more brand-priced antibiotics come to market instead of just generics, the price point is going to be going up over the next 5 years as well, which incentivize companies like Motif to spend money and invest in new antibiotics. So the two indications that we're going after, acute bacterial skin and skin structure, there's 3 million patients just in the US every year. It's easy to find them and recruit them into clinical trials. So Covance has told us we can do 2 trials in skin in about 18 months. So these are our 2 pivotal trials. Probably the larger commercial opportunity is with our second indication, hospital-acquired bacterial pneumonia. This is where a patient goes into hospital for a hip replacement, and the anesthesiologist, the person who gives the anesthetic, administers the windpipe to administer the anesthetic, and that pushes bacteria down into the lungs. And as you can see on the slide, there's anything from a 20 to 50% mortality rate with hospital-acquired bacterial pneumonia. 20% if the physician chooses the right antibiotic on day 1, it doubles within 48 hours if the physician selected the wrong one. We have lots of data, but remember I said you're going to get these slides. This is in vitro data for what's called MIC90s, minimum inhibitory concentrations. Iclaprim is extremely potent, indeed 16-fold more potent than trimethoprim, for example. We have phase 2 data showing that Iclaprim compares very well with vancomycin in complicated skin and skin structure. We have two phase 3 trials showing that Iclaprim compares very well against linezolid. And we have a robust patient safety database already, which contains 500 patients who've already been exposed to Iclaprim, and the FDA has agreed with us that we can take this patient safety database forward into our phase 3 program. So here are our 2 phase 3 trials. As I mentioned, 600 patients in each trial. We're comparing Iclaprim against vancomycin, an FDA endpoint at day 2 to 3, and a European endpoint at day 21 to 28. We've actually been able to make 4 improvements over the previous phase 3 trials, including the comparator, a more optimized dose, lining up against the new endpoints, and more patients. We also have really good phase 2 data in hospital pneumonia, again comparing Iclaprim against vancomycin. And one of the reasons that gets us excited about this indication is that when you administer Iclaprim to patients intravenously, it concentrates 20 to 30 times in lung tissue, which is exactly where you want to try and treat pneumonia. So here's our timeline. We're on track to have the 2 skin trials finished second half of 2017. Because we have QIDP, FDA has to turn that around in 6 months. So we're looking for an approval mid-2018. Depending on availability of capital, I'd like to be able to get going with the phase 3 hospital-acquired bacterial pneumonia trial beginning of next year. We also have an oral formulation in development, and we have a number of pipeline opportunities. In fact, we're actively working on 4 pipeline opportunities to license in other novel antibiotics that work in a completely different way to Iclaprim. So we listed on April the 2nd at 20 pence a share. We closed today, I think, at 59 last time I looked. So we've done quite well in a short period of time, and we're quite happy about that. We listed on AIM because we had to become a public company in order to close the transaction to acquire Iclaprim. So it was a bit of a rush at the time, but we got it done, and we're going in the right direction. My only concern is, at 59p, my market cap right now is only about £88 million. That's not very good for a phase 3 pharmaceutical company. Why do I say that? So here's a company on NASDAQ called Paratech. So if you convert my 88 million pounds to dollars, it's about $135 million. Paratech is right on top of us in terms of development of their first antibiotic. Their market cap's close to $400 million. Two other companies, Sempra and Tetraphase. Sempra is now, that was the 23rd of October. Sempra is now over $1 billion. Sempra and Tetraphase are a little bit ahead of us. So what's Paratech got that Motif doesn't have? NASDAQ listing and some more cash. I can't ignore either of those two things. Right now, we're building the team. We were fortunate enough to do a follow-on raise in July, where we brought in another 22 million pounds. The cornerstone investor was Invesco, took 12.5 of that. We now have Invesco, Aviva, and Standard Life as our institutional investors who are there for the long term to support us as we move forward. Now that I have a bit more cash on board, we're moving from being a virtual company, which I was prior to April, to having the right executive leadership team in place. We have a phenomenal chief medical officer in David Huang, liked by the FDA. Opinion leader community likes him a lot. Used to work at Pfizer on antibiotics and then was at another NASDAQ company developing antibiotics, antibacterials. And then I'll just call out Dr. Bob McCormack. He's our regulatory expert in the US. He was formerly head of regulatory at a company called Cubist. Cubist is arguably the most successful dedicated antibiotic company in the recent past. It was acquired for $9.5 billion by Merck & Co. Inc. in January. So I'm really trying to surround myself with people that are a lot smarter than me and can actually get the job done. Catherine and Jim, formerly executive VPs at Schering-Plough and Merck. So they used to run the whole R&D organization at two major pharma companies. Extremely comforting to me to have such quality people around me. We have a great board chaired by Richard Morgan, who was the co-founder of Celgene, rather successful company. He's had a couple of other exits, Medisense and Sequus. He remained on the board of Celgene until about 2008, I think, and now has a company called Amphion, which starts companies like Motif. So Amphion was the originator, if you like, the original founder, investor in Motif, and remains a major shareholder. Currently, Amphion has 26.14% of Motif. So we have a great board, two finance experts on the top, John and Charlotta. John's based in New York, Charlotta's based here in London. Zaki and Bruce are the two former pharma commercial experts. And then we have two top quality clinicians, Dr. John Stakes and Dr. Mary Lake Poland. Excellent scientific advisory board. We had a really, really good scientific advisory board meeting at what's called ID Week in San Diego last month. And they gave us some excellent ideas as to what we should be looking at next with Iclaprim. And that's basically the story. That's my nutshell slide again. So happy to take any questions that you might have.
Questions, anybody? Gentleman down the front. Oh, gentleman in the front.
Can you say when the drug was first patented and by who?
The original patent was Hoffmann-La Roche many years ago. It was abandoned around probably 2010, but it's irrelevant to us because it's an antibiotic. So we have 10 years of market exclusivity in the US and 10 years of data exclusivity in Europe, which is much.
That's why you keep emphasizing
QIDP.
protection rather than patent protection.
Yeah, so when I was at Merck & Co. Inc., one of the things I did was ran the global Fosamax business, which was a $3.2 billion business. And I spent way too many hours with patent attorneys, litigation experts, and it was becoming apparent that generic companies are becoming so adept at finding ways to invent around patents and launch at risk. Market exclusivity and data exclusivity is a much better barrier to entry than patents these days. So that was a really important part of our diligence, and the follow-on raise in July with Invesco, Aviva, Standard Life was contingent upon us getting QIDP.
Any other questions at all? You mentioned about your share price and the market cap, and yet I think one of your non-executives dug in deep to his pocket in early October and bought 100,000 shares at 60p.
Dr. John Stakes,
What
yes.
does he know then?
He's on the board. He knows exactly where we're going with this. We believe that relative to many pharma biotech investments, we are incredibly de-risked from a clinical perspective because Iclaprim has already completed 2 successful phase 3 trials. So we're going into phase 3 with 500 patients in our safety database. We know it works, and we know it has a great safety profile. From a regulatory perspective, we're incredibly de-risked because we've had meetings with the FDA, we've had meetings with what's called the MEB, the regulator in the Netherlands, and we're incredibly de-risked from a manufacturing perspective because Motif owns 600 plus kilos of what's called API, active pharmaceutical ingredient. I need about 3 of that, 3 kilos for the phase 3 trials. I have 600 plus. So relative to most pharma biotech investments, we're really, really de-risked. And so Dr. Stakes decided it was appropriate to invest himself because he sees, even though we've gone from 20p to 60p, we're not anywhere close to coming off that trend. Just looking at our comparable companies on NASDAQ.
Thank you. Any
Question. When you talk about the 10 years of exclusivity in the US, when's that going to happen and how important is it?
Yeah, so that starts on the date of approval, which we would expect to be in 2018. So it lasts until 2028. So we would not, it would be illegal for any generics to launch before 2028. And that's the way that that operates is the FDA will not accept generic filings until close to 2028.
question at the very back?
Hi. If you've had successful phase 3 trials, why is the product not in the market?
Great question. So what happened back in 2008, 2009 is Equa-prim was one of 4 antibiotics that were put in front of the FDA, and the FDA had a similar response for all 4, which was, please go and do some more studies. And what was going on was the FDA had, about 2 years prior to that, approved an antibiotic called Ketec, Sanofi-Aventis antibiotic. Telithromycin was the active ingredient. And unfortunately, after they'd approved it, they found that it was causing severe liver toxicity. And then it got a bit worse. They found that there were fraudulent safety data from a French trial site. And so it was a very embarrassing time for the FDA. And in fact, they kind of cleaned shop, removed the leadership team from the anti-infectives division, and put in a new team of people. So the new team coming in obviously said, well, we can't have another Ketec on our hands. So they kept, if you like, moving the goalposts. So if you were looking very carefully at the slides, and you're going to get a copy of them, back in 2008, the previous sponsor, a company called Arpida, did a study in complicated skin and skin structure infections. FDA, in their wisdom, decided that they would redefine the disease as acute bacterial skin and skin structure infections. It's defined as surgical wounds, abscesses, erysipelas, minimum lesion size of 75 square centimeters. Complicated skin and skin structure also included burns, ulcers, all sorts of other weird stuff. So they moved the goalpost in the definition of disease. The next thing they did was they said, we're going to move our primary measure of efficacy, the primary endpoint. So it used to be what's called clinical test of cure. So you treat patients for 10 to 14 days, then you wait another week and you measure how many patients are totally cured. That's still what the European regulator requires as their primary endpoint. FDA said, no, we want to see these antibiotics working quickly. So we want to see lesion reduction size of at least 20%, 48 to 72 hours after starting treatment. And then the third thing that they changed at the time was Arpida had written agreement from the FDA that their non-inferiority trial versus linezolid should show non-inferiority at the minus 12.5% level. And they did. And so when they sent the NDA, they were convinced that they were going to get approved, which is why they built the 600 kilos of API that now belongs to Motif. And the FDA turned around and said, we've changed our mind. It's now minus 10% instead of minus 12.5%. But the trials had already been completed and powered for minus 12.5%. By the way, the trials pooled together met even the minus 10%, not just the minus 12.5%. One of the two met minus 10, the other one fell outside. That was the excuse that the FDA gave to say, go and do some more studies. And unfortunately, what happened was this was now January 2009. So another $40, $50 million to do another phase 3 program. There was no capital. So Arpedo went bust. So we're in the unique situation that we can benefit from all of this. We've met with the FDA. We understand exactly what their concern was. They've agreed with us that there's nothing wrong with the safety of Iclaprim, which is why they've said the 500 patients in the safety database moves forward with us. They just want us to do a non-inferiority study. They've agreed to vancomycin as the comparator. They've agreed to minus 10%. Are they going to change their minds? Highly unlikely. Remember I said Iclaprim was one of 4. 2 of the 4 antibiotics that also were turned back last time have gone back already and redone their phase 3 program. Both were approved last year. So the guidelines are now up on the FDA's website. You can go and Google ABSSSI trials if you've got nothing better to do. The guidelines are up there. They're very clear. There's precedent from 2 approvals last year. And the other company I mentioned, Paratech, has the 3rd one that was turned back last time. And they have a market cap of $400 million. They're developing omadacycline back through phase 3 again. So it's a very unusual set of circumstances which we can benefit from hugely.
Final question.
You contrasted your market cap to a number of NASDAQ-listed companies. Can you comment on your lead product compared to their lead products?
Yeah, so the Paratech one, it's very interesting actually. They're all, I think, pretty good antibiotics. We need lots of different antibiotics. 2 out of the 3 comparables are studying completely different indications to us. 2 of the 3, Tetraphase and Paratech, are tetracyclines, which are bacteriostatic. They're targeting gram-negative bugs. The 3rd one, Sempra, their antibiotic is a macrolide. It's called solithromycin, and it's actually chemically very close to telithromycin, which is Ketec, which is the one that started off this whole problem at the FDA. They just announced their 2nd phase 3 results about 2 weeks ago now, and they had some elevated liver enzymes. So I think it's probably still approvable, but they're good antibiotics. I would say so, wouldn't I? But with the differentiation slides that I went through, I think Iclaprim has a really, really good fit compared to these other 3 companies.
Do I take from what you're saying you've had no elevated liver enzymes?
With the IV formulation, that is absolutely correct. I hinted there was one slide where I said we have an oral formulation to follow on. That had run into elevated liver enzyme issues. We have actually on the 24th of this month, we have a scientific advisory board with 2 specialist hepatologists. We have a number of hypotheses, including that it's, if you're familiar with all this, something called first pass effect. So if you take a pill, the whole dose gets absorbed from the stomach, hits the liver immediately. If that turns out to be the correct hypothesis, that's a pretty straightforward fix with a formulation, slow down absorption, or bypass first pass effect with a sublingual soft melt, rapid dissolve tablet. So oral had some elevated liver enzymes. We've got to figure out exactly what was causing them. Elevated liver enzymes were not seen at the doses that we're using with the IV formulation.
Thank you, Graham. Thank you very much indeed.
Very much indeed.